It's finally here, the new Dior Homme Parfum 2025. I was fortunate enough to get my hands on this fragrance a few days before the release, and because this is such a new release, obviously there were no testers, so I had to blind buy this fragrance, and honestly, I am really glad I did because let me tell you guys, this stuff is awesome. And before we talk about the scent itself, let's talk about three things very quickly. Number one being that this fragrance is not a reformulation of the old Dior Homme Parfum. As far as I understand, this is a new flanker. And this new flanker has a new perfumer. It is none other than the great Francis Kurkdjian, the mastermind behind Maison Francis Kurkdjian and amazing fragrances such as Grand Soir and Oud Satin Oud. Finally, before we dive into this fragrance, I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate how beautiful this new bottle actually is. I honestly think this might be my favorite design for the Dior Homme bottles. Now, before making this video, I already gave this fragrance a couple wears, but let's give it a couple sprays and talk more about it because this thing was definitely not what I expected. So in the opening of this fragrance, you immediately get that iconic, that buttery smooth iris that Dior Homme line is known for. But in this version of Dior Homme, the iris is not backed by oud and leather, and instead it's backed by a sweetness. And after looking at the notes and doing some research, I found that the sweetness is coming from the mixture of amber and coumarin in this fragrance. And the sweetness that smells similar to vanilla reminded me of another fragrance, and I couldn't put my finger on it when I first smelled it, but now I know it reminds me of Jean Paul Gaultier's La Melle Parfum, but now with an added iris note. And this combination of sweet and iris notes makes this fragrance a lot more versatile and a lot easier to wear. This version is definitely lighter, it's not as loud, it's not as dark as the old version of Dior Homme Parfum which had oud and leather. And as this fragrance dries down, more and more of that sweetness starts to come through. It's a pretty linear scent all throughout, it doesn't really change from start to beginning, which is very crazy considering how much the old Dior Homme Parfum changes. This new version of Dior Homme Parfum is definitely a lot more mass appealing than the old version. It's also much more versatile and easier to wear to a lot more settings. As much as I love the original Dior Homme Parfum, I did think it was a bit too polarizing, a bit too strong, and very hard to wear. I couldn't find the right setting to wear that fragrance because of how loud and how powerful that fragrance was. And I also think that the original Dior Homme Parfum was much more of a mature fragrance, whereas this new sweeter version of Dior Homme Parfum can be pulled off by a younger audience. And before wrapping up this review on Dior Homme Parfum, I want to take a moment to talk about the longevity and the projection on this fragrance. I was honestly very pleasantly surprised with the performance and projection of this fragrance. Every time I wore this fragrance, I got nearly 10 to 11 hours of performance and very good projection. And while the projection was not as loud, not as strong as the original Dior Homme Parfum, this still created a very nice scent bubble around me. And so overall, even though this fragrance lost some of its characteristic charm by removing the oud and leather, I still think this is a very good release from the house of Dior. It's a modern take on the beautiful Dior Homme DNA that's a lot more mass appealing, a lot more versatile, and works for a younger audience. And while the Dior Homme purists are going to hate that this fragrance is not as polarizing as it once was, I think this is going to be a mega hit, especially considering that there is no Dior Homme Parfum in North America. I think a lot of people are going to like this release, and I'd give this a solid 8.5 out of 10. And I definitely recommend trying this fragrance out. And I definitely recommend you try the other flankers of the Dior Homme line. Even though this thing is amazing, it is not my favorite version. My favorite version of this fragrance is Dior Homme Intense. So definitely check that one out and let me know if you've tried this new fragrance and what you think of it.